All right, today we're talking about CBS Knowledge Standard 5, the principles of rule-governed behavior. All right, so what is the problem that we are trying to solve? Basically, it is the problem of how to deal with indirect contingencies. So just as a reminder, direct contingencies, where the direct experience in the environment is going to influence the probability of a behavior increasing or decreasing or not changing in the future. Those are called direct contingencies, and we have a good account for that, right? So I have a good example here. Very simple that you have a rock as our antecedent stimulus. If you bite on it and you get the consequence that biting on it hurts your teeth, that consequence will function or could potentially function as a direct contingency that will change the rate of behavior, likely will decrease the rate of biting rocks in the future. So we have a direct contingency account. But what about future consequences, ones that have never been before experienced or probabilistic? They may or may not happen. These are indirect contingencies, and it's not clear how they can come to control behavior, right? Like, obviously, when someone says something like, brush your teeth so they don't fall out when you're older, if we haven't had any teeth fall out because of our brushing or lack of brushing, that consequence, we don't have any direct experience with it. So how is it uh, that statement is going to come to control our behavior? Because even though we don't have time travel where the future consequence comes back, this thing of sort of following these statements and following health advice to avoid a future we haven't lived yet, or saving money for retirement when we haven't retired yet, these are like pretty common human experiences. So um, it's important that we have an account of these kind of indirect contingencies. So historically, this phenomenon was known for a long time. Skinner talked about it, and he gave it the name rule-governed behavior, also known as instructional control, right? So a lot of these things are basically instructions, right? Like brush your teeth so that they don't fall out. That's an instruction to follow. And for a long time, it was observed that humans could do this, and they had different performance patterns under different conditions. So if you looked at like direct contingencies, so you had them come into the lab and say, hey, just kind of figure out what the rules of the game are, and just had them start going, and red dots were more valuable than green dots, they would figure that out. You could also bring them in and give them instructions, right? So you could tell them like red dots are more valuable than green dots. And an interesting thing happens, right? So in those experiments, after a while, they change the rules, and suddenly the green dots are maybe more valuable than the red dots. And what they noticed is that when people were learning and had their behavior under kind of direct contingency control, they are much better at sort of tracking those changes, and so updating their responses when the contingencies change. And they are kind of insensitive to doing that, or can be, when they have those instructions. So the fact that they are sort of following an instruction given them to them by the experimenter, or maybe a self-derived rule where they're like, okay, yeah, like red ones are the good ones, they are less sensitive to those changes, and so they might kind of follow the pattern of responding to reds even when it shifts and green becomes more reinforcing. And that problem was called the insensitivity to context. So that was already known. So we had this kind of description, like we knew this happened and we saw it happening. But for a while, there was not a fully behavioral analytic account that could really describe this and sort of meet the criteria of prediction and influence that we are seeking. So, of course, now you are RFT ninjas, and in this case, that's good because RFT comes to the rescue. So, the problem basically with the early accounts was that there wasn't really a way for this antecedent stimulus, this sort of verbal statement of the rule, to really function in the way that we wanted to. So it couldn't quite work to have this sort of sort of just random verbal statement, and then people respond, to some aspect of that a statement, and then they get some kind of consequence. There wasn't really a way to account for it in kind of ABA principles at the time. But of course, Skinner and other people, nobody knew about stimulus equivalence and RFT. But now we do. And that basically solves the problem here. So we replace our take one with take two. And what we realize is that our antecedent stimulus is not just going to be kind of a verbal statement, just sort of a stream of air. Essentially, our antecedent stimulus is going to be some version of a verbal network. We don't know what level it could be, kind of a complex, multi-layered kind of instruction or a simple instruction, but it's one of those kind of verbal networks that we've looked at from RFT. And the behavior is not going to be so much direct, right? So if the statement is, if you clean your room, I'll let you watch TV. The behavior here is actually that people are going to follow the rule that is entailed by the verbal network through their ability to do R-ing. So we have to have that R-ing RFT ability to understand all of the pieces of the rule. And then the behavior is sort of following what the rule actually says and then getting reinforced by that for rule following. Of course, topographically, that's going to look like cleaning the room. Like in this rule here, if I say, if you clean your room, I'll let you watch TV. So topographically, that may look like the person cleaning their room. But what we're really interested in is the fact that they are cleaning that room potentially um, just through a history of kind of following rules. They may never have gotten TV access. And if the consequence was something that they'd never experienced before or was sort of future and probabilistic, right? Like do your homework so you can get into a good college. Obviously that consequence is delayed and is not going to be controlling the behavior. So when they follow that rule of like study hard so you can get into a good college, what's really being looked at in the ABC contingency there is rule following. And so we just need to recognize that the antecedent stimulus here is going to be some kind of verbal network that people are going to be able to respond to. All right, so let's look at a practical example of this. This is on the CBS website directly. And so we're going to look at the example of a neighbor telling you the rule on the right. If you feed my pet pig while I'm on vacation for the next week, I will give you $50 when I get back. Let's see how that comes to function as a rule. So the rule is going to contain contextual cues that tell us how to relate events, and it's going to change the function of those events. So if we look at some of the terms in the rule here, we've got if you feed my pet pig while I'm on vacation, right? So we have presumably some direct or indirect experience of pigs. So people they know what a pig is in a direct sense. They know what it is to feed a pig, right? And they know that $50 refers to, actual currency that they can get, and they know what those mean. So they understand through this history of relational framing and experience with those objects what the psychological functions of those different things are, and therefore they can be put into this more extended network, right, where they understand what's going to happen in a kind of if-then way. If pig gets fed, then $50 is coming your way. And you can see here again just this idea of this frame of cause and effect, that in this case, those contextual cues tell us that there is a cause and effect relationship of this. So if the pig gets fed, that is going to be the cause of you getting $50. And $50 is going to be the effect of you feeding the pig while the neighbor's on vacation next week. So that's going to change the function. That's going to change the function of feeding the neighbor's pig, right? That might be something that you weren't particularly excited to do, but now feeding your neighbor's pig is now predicting a certain kind of reinforcement. So it might increase your willingness to feed the pig. The other piece that we see in the rule there is these before-after relations, right? So it's telling us that the pig should be fed during the next week and that the $50 will be received after the next week, right? So we understand kind of when this is going to happen, right? Like, so if you start feeding the pig today when the neighbor's there, no guarantee of the money, right? If you start feeding the pig and then you look under the tray to find the money, you're not going to find it, right? Because the cues are telling you that the $50 is going to be received when the neighbor gets back. So in this way, you can see how all these frames kind of participate, come together to what um, for folks that are kind of fluent in English is a relatively straightforward understanding, right? Like, if you feed my pet pig while I'm on vacation for the next week, I'll give you $50 when I get back. It's easy to miss that there are several kind of relations in there that work together to create a verbal network that establishes a rule here. And so when we put it all together, we can see this relational network that is functioning as a rule. So we have at the top, right, the feeding of the pig during the next week becomes the cause of receiving $50 the next week. And by putting it together in this way, by following those principles of mutual entailment and combinatorial entailment and transformation of stimulus functions, all those things that we see in RFT, we can see how a person can come to have an understanding of this rule, even if they've never fed the neighbor's pig before, right? Even if they've never received money from the neighbor before. And if the neighbor were offering something unique that they'd never experienced before, they could understand what that unique reinforcement might be from the rule, all through their ability to do arbitrarily applicable relational responding. And what we also see is that the person follows the rule can then now detect whether or not they are following the rule. In other words, they can track, am I doing the thing that I expect will give me the $50? So they can tell whether there's correspondence or not to the relational network specified by the rule. So they can self-monitor their own following of rules that are specified by these complex verbal networks. And when we see this, when we see that the functions of these environmental events, like feeding a friend's pig, when they've been changed by their participation in the relational network, then we might have an example of rule-governed behavior. And people are then following this rule, or being reinforced for following the rule itself. That is to say, like, their ability to do R-ing means that they can respond in ways that might lead them to certain kinds of consequences. And this is how we can have an indirect acting contingency, like a rule about future behavior. So, as I say, RFT to the rescue. Okay, so now we have this RFT account of rules, and we know that rule following is when we're being reinforced for actually following the rule. And so there's been kind of an important distinction made in the literature about different kinds of rule following that might be of interest. The three kinds, the empirical support for this is pretty limited so far. So I'm only going to talk about two. I'm going to skip augmentals. You can Google that. You can read more about that. But the other two forms are pretty important. So even though the empirical literature is pretty limited right now, as a heuristic tool, I think these are really useful. So I did want to talk about these. So the first kind is what's called pliance or plies. Comes from the root word for compliance. And what this refers to is when we see rule following that's based on the consequences mediated by another person. Another kind of a fancy way of saying, do it because someone says so. So when we see people that are following rules because the consequence of them following or not following the rule is going to be mediated by another person, right? Like praise or yelling, punishment, loss of consequences. We would say, in a sense, they are following the rule just because the person wants them to, right? So we often see this like with kids when we're working on early compliance. We want them to listen to mom because mom gave the rule, not necessarily because they understand why mom's doing this, not because they necessarily agree, but just mom gave a rule, mom expects her rules to be followed, and consequences are going to come when you follow or don't follow, right? So that is called appliance. We typically think about that as kind of following rules from other people, from parents, from teachers, and so on. But over time, we can abstract this, and we can essentially have pliance with ourselves. In other words, we can follow our own rules just because we gave them, right? The other form of a rule following that's really important to think about is called tracking, or we might just say tracks. And this is when rule following seems to be controlled based on the consequences specified by the rule, right? So when we have a rule like go to the post office early so you don't have to wait in line for a long time, if that is being followed because there's some correspondence with that, like there's a history of going early to the post office and not having to wait in line, and it's not because mom said go early, it's not because you said, good people, wake up early and go to the post office. If it's really happening because of the consequences specified in the rule, then we would call that an example of tracking. And of course, like with any behavior, this could be under the function of multiple forms of control. There could be elements of pliance and tracking within the same one, but it is a very useful one to think about clinically. And that is because when people are following, uh, doing things based on pliance, we might want to think about if that is kind of unhelpful pliance, right? Are people too kind of people pleasing, or just responding to whatever is sort of given to them by others, and maybe not having a pliant response would be useful. It's also helpful to think about tracking because there's a lot of ways that tracking can sort of go wrong. So one is that there can be inaccurate tracking, right? So like it's very easy to make up verbal rules, and just the fact that we can make up a verbal rule doesn't mean that it really tracks anything in the world. I like to think about tracking using the metaphor of GPS, right? So GPS devices, they tell us sort of how to get to our destination, and many times they are helpful and correct, and we want to follow the GPS if we want to get to the destination that it's directing us to. But we also know that sometimes GPS can be wrong, right? Like sometimes GPS tells us to turn right, and there's now a brick wall to the right. If we were to turn right, it will not get us to our destination. It will crash our car, right? So we can have inaccurate tracking. We can have rules that are not that helpful. In more of a psychological context, we might have something like advertising, right? That says like, buy all this stuff and you'll be happy. That's a rule we can follow, but it might be inaccurate. We might buy all that stuff and not get happiness. We also could have the possibility of impossible tracking. So um, turning right when there's a brick wall is an example. We cannot go down the street if there's a brick wall that is blocking us. In more of a psychological context, we might have a rule like don't have childhood trauma if you want to have a successful life, right? Like there may be a lot of benefits, like if right, a lot to recommend to avoiding childhood trauma if you want to have a successful life. But for people who have a history of childhood trauma, that rule is impossible to follow. They cannot go back in time and not have that trauma. So if that's the kind of tracking that they're doing, right, to sort of say like, I'll be happy when I don't have my childhood trauma, they may be setting themselves up for an impossible task. And the other thing we might see with tracking is that there are insensitivity to changes in context that affect the rule, right? So I'll give you this example. A lot of folks sort of feel like maybe they're not good at making friends, or that people don't like them, and there, of course, if we look into the history, we'll understand how that came to be. And it's possible that there was a time when that rule sort of did make sense, right? Like if you had this rule, like if someone's mean to you in seventh grade, give up on making friends so that you don't keep getting disappointed. Like that rule might have actually worked in seventh grade, right? Like you could have been in a school where no matter what you did, you weren't going to get any friends in seventh grade. That rule could have been true for you. But does that rule still apply many years later, right? Is it still the case that there's no point in trying? The only thing you can do is to avoid disappointment by sort of just not trying. Like people can lose that sensitivity to context, and they probably don't say things like, when I was in seventh grade, the thing that made the most sense was this. They might have a more kind of generalized tracking rule that says something like, I'm just not the kind of person who people like, so I need to give up on trying to make friends, right? That might be a relatively insensitive uh, uh, kind of tracking that they would want to do, and it might be a source of clinical intervention. So we've got several clinical implications from this. So the first is just that awareness of the link between RFT skills and rule following. So especially I think when we're working with children or folks that are potentially showing difficulties with complex verbal behavior, we cannot make assumptions that they can go through and use all of the kind of R-ing skills to easily follow the rule, to understand what it means, and then to track if they are following it. So if the RFT skills are not in place or are weak, we need to catch that. And I think we need to adjust our clinical intervention to go where people are at and not assume that just because people can say yes or no to a complicated rule that they understand it. We really need to test and see if they are making kind of all the relevant derivations so that they can respond to the rule um, in real time. And second, we should think about whether we are seeing that insensitivity to context that might be contributing to clinical problems, right? So some of that could be an issue of awareness. In other words, if people can't kind of discriminate, see in the environment some of the things that the rule is talking about, they aren't going to be able to respond well to the rule. But in other cases, they might actually be able to kind of understand all of the implications of the rule, but they may be just kind of doing unhelpful verbal rule following, right? The sort of idea of I'm not even going to try to make friends. I've already kind of landed on a rule that says I'm going to avoid pain by not trying to make friends. So we might see that insensitivity to context. We might also need to consider whether rule following seems to be under the control of pliance or tracking, and I think particularly for behaviors that are associated with the presenting problem. So we want to see like are people uh, trying to track? Are they trying to sort of follow the setting rules that they then are following because the rules actually kind of play out and work for them, or are they following rules because they are kind of responding pliantly to the demands of other people, or this is a key one, responding to their own demands, basically internalizing the voice of others that said you need to follow just because I said. We can become our own sort of taskmaster, right? And say, I give myself a rule and I need to follow it because that's what I do. I follow rules. That kind of inflexibility might lead to kind of ineffective outcomes. People might not get the life that they want because they're working so hard to just kind of be sort of following the rules that someone else gave them or that they're giving themselves. So watch for pliance, watch for tracking. Think about whether tracking is working as it should. Fourth, when we think about the clinical interventions, how do we work with rules? There's two main ways. We can work on changing the rules, right? So if you have a rule that says like I I wasn't liked in seventh grade, nobody will ever like me. Like we could potentially change that rule to sort of say like try a lot of things, and if people seem nice, invest more time in them, right? Like work to develop friendship. So we can genuinely create new rules and help people try to track them better and follow them if they're working. But the other main way we can work with rules is we can change the impact of them. So, for example, if you think about diffusion, someone might have a rule like, I can't let myself get overwhelmed. And that could be like a well practiced, very familiar rule, hard to directly challenge and find something else to replace it with. So, what we might want to do is try to change the context so that that rule doesn't function as such a strong control of behavior, and use a diffusion strategy, right? Like have somebody say, like, my mind is really screaming the thought that I can't let myself get overwhelmed. Try to get some distance from that verbal network and see that it doesn't need to control behavior. So we change the functional impact of the rule without challenging or changing the content of the rule itself, and then helping people build maybe new rules, really, really kind of closely tied to what their direct experience is showing them, and making sure that the rules that they're following are really tracking and working in the way that they claim to be. And the fifth implication here is around this concept of workability, which I think is a challenging one in ACT. We obviously say that we we aren't choosing what behaviors we're going to reinforce or what clients should do. We ask, kind of how well those behaviors work in context. But to really answer that question, I think we have to recognize that we're really working with lots of different learning processes there, right? We have the direct contingencies, right? Operant and Pavlovian, right? We also have relational frames going on. So we have derived relational responding. And then when we add in this piece of rule governed behavior, where we might potentially be kind of following rules and relatively insensitive to the specific context in front of us, we can see how when all of those come together, there is a chance that we have unworkable responses, or clients are making unworkable responses to get what they want from life. And helping them consider that means we have to look at kind of all of those pieces. We have to look at those kind of non-arbitrary things, right? Like we do live in a three-dimensional world, it seems, and so we do need to be sensitive to the kind of non-arbitrary features of things, but we also have to be sensitive to the arbitrary sort of features of context, the derived relational responding that we do. We also have to be aware of the rule governed behavior that we might be following. And then, of course, we also have to be sensitive to the specific kind of, operant conditions. Like we do get rewards and punishments and things like that. And all of that comes together. And we have to navigate this place of workability. And I think when we recognize that all of them come together, we can see how some of these core competencies play out. So if we look at like the ACT core competency rating form, where they're looking to see if the therapist is actively using the concept of workability in clinical interactions. And then if we dig into that a little bit using the behavioral anchor from the ACT FM, where the therapist uses experiential methods or questions to help the client notice and use their own experience rather than thoughts about their experience. What they're saying there, right, is that people might kind of feel like they are responding based on their direct experience. This is what works for me, but they're not catching that in doing that, they are sort of following a rule there, or there might be some derived relational responding where they are focusing on this kind of symbolic quality to it, and they might be missing some of the more direct experience. Um, uh, some of the operant contingencies, those pieces. And we want to bring those kind of all together so that people are seeing the workability, not just as kind of a symbolic concept, but are really tying it to like how it unfolds for them. Like given everything, like in this space as a breathing, existing human being who has these different learning processes going on, is my response sort of optimally um, moving me towards what I want? And kind of putting all those other things kind of on a leash, right? If I'm excessively rule following, then I want to change that. If I'm not following rules enough, if I'm just kind of going along, just sort of responding to immediate opportunities in life, and I'm not doing some of these kind of leader then sort of valuing pieces, that might not be particularly workable. And so there is a little bit of tracking and rule governed behavior that I want. So there's no kind of um, exact answer, right? It depends. But to answer that question, help clients do that well, we really have to be alive to all of these different levels of direct contingencies, the RFT, relational responding, and the rule governed behavior. If we put all of those together, then I think we can ask this question of like, how does it all come together? And is it supporting kind of overall well functioning for this person, like workability, a life worth living? So I think you're going to need all of those to really understand the kind of concept of workability in ACT. And finally, I just want to wrap up by saying, there's a lot of background that we've talked about with the different learning processes and putting them all together. And I think it's now where it's really starting to pay off. We haven't talked about a lot of like techniques and stuff, and that's been intentional. Like I think people get distracted a little bit on learning techniques and then trying to bring the techniques back to the principles, and that is challenging. We've been starting more with this idea of like working from the basic principles of like functional contextualism and learning processes. And now that we have rule governed behavior and RFT, we can put it together and we're now really ready to do function based intervention. So, ready to do things like the ACT matrix or the choice point. Here, I've got a version of Ross Harris's choice point updated by Lou Lasforgato. Uh, that's talking about the choice point, but framing it in ways that should look very familiar now in terms of antecedents, behavior, and consequences. And so now, if you're looking at like a verbally competent person in front of you who's talking, right, about the future and the past, you can use an ABC analysis like this, and you can do it. You can add the RFT bits, and you can add the rule governed bits, and you can add the operant contingency bits. So you can add all of the pieces together, and you can see what we're really looking at. This is a framework that can accommodate both those direct contingencies of what actually happens, those in the in the environment, as well as those kind of symbolic rule following things. So when we say a towards move, right, there's a symbolic piece of that, right? Like what is a towards move for one client is not for every other client. So we need that ability to have that symbolic relating to decide what do we mean by towards moves, but then also to look at like what happens in the environment, both at a symbolic level and kind of at a practical direct contingency level that either supports those towards move or supports those away moves. And then we can start to think about how do we mix it up? What do we need to mix and match with our intervention to help people kind of not get hooked and respond in ways that they would say move them away from what they care about in the choice point, and or to stay unhooked and move towards those things that matter to them. Uh, Toward moves in the choice point, right? And so we need that functional analysis that can go everywhere, right? It can go into direct contingencies, can go into RFT, can go into rule governed behavior, right? And when you put it all together, you're now ready to start doing kind of functional analysis with every client in front of you. And that's it for rule governed behavior today. Thanks, everybody.